A friend of mine recently asked about glute training because she's back into bodybuilding mode, and she wanted my opinion on what were the best exercises for glutes. And then she also asked about whether I thought that glute bridges were an effective exercise. And in terms of the glute bridges, I said I do not think they are very effective, and I'm going to explain why in this video. But then the best exercises, the exercise I think from my research, which is probably the best for overall glute development, even though you probably can't use as heavy weights, although you can use heavier weights, would be single leg step-ups. Actually, they are, from what I was researching, they are listed rather highly, or the highest, in terms of glute max activation during hip extension based exercises. So that's what this video is going to be about. The first reason I don't think glute bridges are very good exercises is not because the glute bridge is the problem, it's just the fact that no one can actually do them correctly because everyone's overusing their lower back. So I'm going to show you a picture, and I just randomly screenshotted this from a video on YouTube which has, probably millions of views at this point. But the problem is you see that the person's lower back is in a complete state of extension. Her back is too arched. If your back is too arched, your pelvis will remain forward. If you want to call it an anterior pelvic tilt, call it an anterior pelvic tilt. But if it's in that position, the glutes are not positioned properly to actually activate fully. So just the fact that you're seeing someone's back arch up so high, they're not using their glutes effectively. It just can't happen biomechanically. It can't occur because you're very rarely going to see someone with a very arched lower back and a pelvis that's neutral. So, number one, most people are doing glute bridges in a state of lumbar extension. So by default, their pelvis will not be in the right position for those glutes to activate the way you think they're going to activate. Number two, you can't separate pelvic extension. So pelvic extension is flexion, extension, flexion, extension. When the left side comes forward, that's flexion. The right side should go into extension at the same time. And then they reverse. It's called walking. One side flexes, one side extends. It's only really in exercises that we'd have, gym exercises, that we would have both sides of the pelvis extend at the same time. That's not normal human movement. And because we know we are asymmetrical humans, it's not going to happen equally on both sides for the vast majority of people because we're not symmetrical. That right diaphragm, the bigger right diaphragm over the right side of the pelvis and the right hamstring and the right glute are going to make it more effective at extension, while the left side is much better at flexion. But this exercise, a two-leg glute bridge, is something, what you're trying to do is trying to get both sides into extension at the same time to work both glutes. Well, it turns out that with 2 feet on the floor, and this is what you can find in the research, with 2 feet on the floor at the same time during an exercise like this, you're going to get more hamstring activity than anything else. So the glutes will be involved, but the hamstrings are going to be more involved. So just alone, it's not a great glute exercise. But the other part is this, breathing. The only way to get, this is called the pelvic inlet, this is the outlet. The only way to get pelvic inlet extension is if your lower back is relaxed. If your lower back is tight, it's going to pull the pelvis up like into a state of flexion, into that anterior pelvic tilt position on one or both sides. And again, that's the PEC pattern, the bilateral PEC pattern in postural restoration. The only way to get that lower back to relax and thus the pelvic inlets to go back into extension so that you can actually do a glute bridge of this type is diaphragmatic breathing. If you're not breathing with your diaphragm, well, if your lower back is overarched to begin with, if you're extended, you will not be using your diaphragms. And if you're not using your diaphragms, you're going to be overusing your neck and your lower back to help you breathe. These are accessory muscles of breathing. This whole channel is about that and how to turn those muscles off. If those muscles are overactive for breathing, you stay in extension. If you stay in extension in lower back, I'm talking about lower back extension. If you stay in that state of extension while doing an exercise, any exercise, you're not going to get that pelvis to go into flexion, or I'm sorry, to go into extension. It's just not going to happen. Your hip flexors, the other part is the hip flexors are going to stay overactive as the lower back muscles stay overactive. If they stay overactive, your glutes are not going to activate appropriately because they are antagonists. They work opposite each other. So without proper breathing during the exercise, if you hold your breath or you're just doing them in a state of extension, which means your pelvis will be forward on one or both sides. So you'll either be a left AIC, you'll be in a left AIC position or a PEC position, bilateral PEC position. Your glutes cannot activate properly in that position anyway. So those are the issues with a glute bridge in regards to how people actually do them because of how they're living. Theoretically, they're not a terrible exercise. Well, they're not very effective for building glute strength, but they're not a terrible exercise if you just want to activate your glutes, as long as someone was doing them in a state of with a pelvis in a state of neutrality that could achieve that pelvic extension so that the glutes can turn on, even though the hamstrings will turn on more. So theoretically, they're fine, but people aren't living like that. And if you read the comments on this video, the vast majority of people aren't feeling anything correctly. Some people are feeling nothing. They're feeling their quads, they're feeling their back, they're feeling one glute or not the other. I mean, very few people say, yeah, I really feel this. And I don't even know if they really know what they're feeling. But so that's the problem with the traditional glute bridge. It's just not effective because of how people are existing, not because there's anything wrong with the exercise. So now what I'm going to show you is what I would do for people if they wanted to train glutes heavy. I would first have to establish that they're neutral. Now, of course, I'm not with anyone who's watching this video, so I can't test you. And when I say neutral, again, if you're new to this channel, adduction drop test, that's the main test for the pelvis to see if the position is, if the pelvis is stuck forward on one or both sides, or if it can achieve a state of neutrality. So what I'm going to show you, this video is going to be an example of how to achieve pelvic neutrality using the proximal hamstrings. Remember, you want to use your hamstrings to establish stability of the pelvis, or hamstrings and adductors, and essentially, and glutes to a degree. All right, so glutes will contribute, but they're not going to contribute if you're trying to train heavy and your pelvis is forward. They will not contribute to pelvic neutrality in that state. They'll only produce power if the pelvis is already neutral. And then you can start to actually use those glutes to produce power. Okay, so in this video, I have my feet elevated on a 2-inch rubber block, and I'm putting my right hand on my right upper chest, my left hand on my left lower ribs, and I'm just showing how breathing has to happen. You'll see my hands rise with inhalation, and they will sink towards the floor with exhalation. And that will establish that you have to do that during an exercise to make sure that you're not holding your breath and that your diaphragms are pumping. If you hold your breath, you're going to tighten yourself up. That's counterproductive. So that's the way you're going to need to breathe. You should feel your ribs expand and go down. Then I lift my butt up. So I think of my butt as a piece of tape. I just peel it up a little bit off the ground through sensing my heels. My lower back is staying flat, and I do feel my glutes, but more hamstring in this position, because remember, with 2 feet on the floor, hamstrings are going to be more active. And then I just breathe. So I keep my butt slightly elevated, my back is flat, and I just breathe, and I feel the air go into my rib cage. As I inhale and exhale, I blow all the air out to get all the ribs to come down. And that's all you got to do. At that point, my pelvis is not forward, it's in a state of inlet extension. Now my glutes and hamstrings are in a position in which they can actually activate properly. If the pelvis is forward and you do it, which a lot of people are because their backs are too arched, those muscles are not working properly. Okay, so that's the technique, and you can just watch it. And you would do about 5 breaths very slowly. And again, you're pressing your heels down into the floor. You could put a ball between your knees, a small ball, and squeeze the ball a little bit. That'll give some adductor activity also. Butt's up, so I got my hamstrings. I'm feeling my hamstrings up towards the top, closer to the butt. I'm establishing pelvic stability through those muscles in a relaxed state, not in a tense state. After that, what I could then do if you want to train your glutes, then I would go to something like a single leg, like a step up, and I would use heavier weights for weights that you could only do between 6 and 10 reps. If you can't, I wouldn't make the step too high. I would use about 12. Well, you want to make sure when you're doing the step up that I think it would be best for your knee to be well below your hip. So I use about 12 inches. If the knee is too high, you're probably going to break down with form, and you're not going to be able to do the heavier weights safely, so that would be counterproductive. So I would keep the knee much lower than the hip. It might be the equivalent of a quarter to a half a squat, somewhere between a quarter and a half a squat. And so I would use single leg glute bridge, not glute bridge, single leg step ups to train glutes. Now there's a lot of other glute training exercise which you can do, but this is just one that I think would be a good idea for a lot of people because it also translates to real life much better because we don't, even when you're playing sports, you're generally on one foot or the other because you're usually moving. So, 2 feet on the ground is not necessarily the most transferable in terms of heavy weight training to real life. It'll get you stronger and it will certainly develop muscles, but in terms of carryover to the way humans actually move and to prevent you from staying too extended and patterned or to get you out of that position, I would always choose the single leg version more than a two-legged exercise.